Hello, and welcome to Romans chapters 9 to 16. This is going to be a brief isagogical introduction. First of all, the authorship. I don't think we need to tarry long here except to talk a few things about the cultural background of the Apostle Paul. Paul is universally regarded as the author of this. He wrote it with the aid of a scribe, probably was dictated. One of the things that helps with is just to consider the oral nature of this letter, that it was written, spoken to a scribe who would take it in, and it was to be read to people, many of whom may not have had the gift of reading. And so they would have encountered Paul's words for the first time in an oral sense. So Tertius was Paul's scribe. Paul was undoubtedly the author. It is authentically his voice, as we can recognize it also from the book of Galatians and other letters in which there is absolutely no dispute. Paul was himself a Hellenistic Jew, which means he grew up in a household that was Greek speaking. I like to say that his Greek is, although clearly a first language acquisition, spoken as if by someone who has a Jewish accent. He was born in Tarsus, which he himself mentions as no mean city. We'll talk a little bit about that later, where he probably learned his trade. A good father was supposed to raise his child in a trade, and this would have been what his father did for him while he was still a young boy in Tarsus, learning about leatherworking. Later on in his preteen and teen years, he went to Jerusalem, where he studied under the famous Rabbi Gamaliel, who is known to us from other places in Scripture, most notably the book of Acts, who belonged to the school of Hillel, which was considered to be, by some at least, the more easygoing school, maybe a little less rigorous, maybe a little bit more inviting. In any case, Paul didn't learn that from his mentor. Rather, he learned how to be a devout Pharisee who was zealous, as he himself puts it in the book of Galatians, zealous for the traditions of his elders, which means he probably he was probably, when he mentioned that, thinking of being a true Phineas, someone who fulfilled the archetype of Phineas, who was that priest who pierced through with his spear an Israelite man and a Moabite woman in the rebellion of Baal Peor in the book of Numbers. You can read that for yourself, but the point is he did this shocking deed to stem the shocking rebellion of people against their God, and he was commended for it. So the Apostle Paul probably saw himself as zealous for the traditions of the elders, a rigorist. We would consider him to be like from the Wahhabi sect of Islam. Anyway, he saw Christianity as an existential threat. If you think of Judaism as this time sort of revolving around the hub of Torah and temple, then either Torah and temple was at the center of things, or if Christ comes along and fulfills the Torah and he fulfills the whole purpose of the temple sacrifice, the whole temple system, then there's really no more need for those two central ideas in Jewish life. And therefore, then Christianity poses an existential threat to Judaism. So that's no doubt what Paul saw, and he was not going to give up on his Judaism. As zealous for the tradition of his elders, he was going to do everything he could to persecute it and to stamp this sect of Christianoi out. Tarsus, I mentioned, we talk a little bit more about that. It was in itself no mean city, one of the great cities of the Roman Empire at this time, famous for its Stoic philosophy school headed by Athenodorus. Considered to be an Athens of the East. It was really that prominent. It was no mean city, as Paul says. As a Roman citizen, he probably acquired his citizenship from his father, who himself probably acquired it. The most likely version of the events is that in the great conquest of Pompeii, 67 or so BC, Paul's father was captured. And that means he would then have become a slave in those wars, part of the war booty, war pillaging. And he was sold off as a slave, probably to a Roman. And when you gave good service as a slave, you could buy your freedom, or the master might give freedom upon his death, in which case you would be a Roman too if you had been a slave to a Roman. And so Paul, uh, being born to a slave of a Roman citizen, become a freedman, and now himself acquires Roman citizenship. So that gave him some high status in the Roman Empire. So you have this very diverse person, more than a bicultural kid. In fact, you have a man who is conversant in Greek. He's conversant in Hebrew. He calls himself a Hebrew of the Hebrews, which probably means in Philippians 3, verse 5, that he's a speaker of Hebrew from early on in his household, and his mom and papa spoke Hebrew, etc. Sort of like what Germans might have been in the old days in our synod. Um, so he's diverse in the sense that he has a smattering of influence in Stoicism. I wouldn't have said he had done any particular study in the philosophy, but he grew up where it was part of the atmosphere, much as we grow up with postmodernism. And so you can sort of see that he would have imbued that ever since he was young. So we can see bits of that influence in Romans chapter 1, Philippians chapters 1, 2, and 3. You can, and 4, actually. Some terminology that's considered to be almost Stoic in its origin. So he's a man that of many parts, as uh, someone might say, a kind of a world citizen. Jesus had prepared him for his ministry. We're not going to spend a great deal of time talking about Paul's actual ministry, but you can look at any timeline and get that for yourself. The things I want to emphasize that influenced Paul's ability to act as a missionary, I'm going to talk a little bit now on this slide, talking about the cultural and historical background. First of all, there's the fact of the diaspora, that you have Jews that are scattered far and wide from the promised land, here in Greece, in Pontus, in Cilicia, in Babylonia, in Egypt, a whole great colony in there. They reached as far as Rome, and then they later on extended even this far. So they were a city where you had as many Jews living outside of the country as you had living inside the Holy Land itself. In fact, more. Koine Greek was the lingua. Well, the significance of this for Paul's outreach is that, of course, he had a base of operations wherever he went. And if at least some of the Jews of the synagogue would have been converts, then they would have been easy to pick as leaders of these fledgling congregations. You might wonder, how could the congregation where he'd spent maybe 2 or 3 weeks, like Thessalonica, even survive? Well, if you had some God-fearers who were versed in Judaism, if you had some Jews themselves, they would have been able to um, take up the slack of leadership. Stoicism would have been a cultural influence, mystery religions, cult prostitutions. These are all things that you can spend a little bit more time looking at, these cultural influences. If you read Valesky, I think it's very important. Ease of travel. Let's just put it this way. It was by no means a picnic to travel from east to west in the empire, but at least it was possible, as in some eras it clearly was much more arduous than this. The Romans did make it possible for relatively easy travel, although there were still dangers from bandits, bad weather, shipwreck and all the rest, as clearly Paul experienced on his journeys. The Caesar cult is probably something of great importance when you think of Paul's, especially talking about being someone to honor the emperor, in, as he clearly does in Romans 13. Nevertheless, there is only one Lord for a Christian, and we do not regard him, our emperor, as God and Lord. So there are clear distinctions to be drawn here between the types of obedience that we owe to our secular government when it tries to take over that part of our lives, which is also our spiritual loyalty. Religio licita, that's sometimes used to describe the status of Jews in the Roman Empire at this time. It points out the fact that the Jews enjoyed some special benefits. These benefits were then sort of grandfathered into the Christian community. Probably a more accurate way of putting it is that the Christian community at first was just recognized as maybe one of the many sects within Judaism. It wasn't clearly seen as being something that was adverse or different from Judaism. Canonicity, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's almost universally regarded as such. There are some problems at the end. Does 16 belong as part of it? There are some manuscripts that omit the word Romans to the Romans. Let me just put it this way. I think it probably, these manuscript differences probably owe more to the fact that people for churches would want to universalize the letter rather than there being any question that what we have in Romans 1 to 16 is what Paul wrote. Recipients, from the end of the book, we get a clear picture of the type of congregations that Paul was writing to. It was to the Romans. It wasn't necessarily to the ecclesia, but to the ecclesiais of Rome, who gathered probably in smaller house churches with various leaders throughout the city. Given the size of most Roman domiciles, this would not have been so difficult. If it is true that Claudius expelled the Jews in around AD 49, this might have left a power gap in which Gentiles would have had to take the reins of these various congregations. And when the Jews returned after the edict expired, there could have been some friction, let's say, maybe some vying for leadership. Hard to say, really, but many have supposed mighty things from scant information. Time and place of writing, here's one of those things that we can answer with some great firmness. At the end of his third missionary journey, in the late winter, early spring of his sojourn in Corinth, his 3-month sojourn at the end there, where he's gathering in the offering, making ready for his travel back to Jerusalem after gathering that offering for the saints. So we can date it to the early spring of 57 AD from the city of Corinth. There's various references there that you can check out for yourself. Purpose: to create a common foundation in the gospel is probably the simplest way of putting it. Paul wanted to use Rome as a base of operations, just as he had had a base of operations in Antioch in the eastern half of the empire. So now, as he cast his eyes going further to the west, in Spain, he wanted the Roman Christians to be able to give him a firm foundation of support and prayer when he came back from those journeys. A couple of things to remark here then. You have the most theologically extensive book in all the New Testament, in depth, as really a missionary letter. So this is really kind of proof positive that we don't dumb down the gospel when we seek to establish fellowship in a mission field. We want to have a basis for cooperation and coordination, co-working together in the gospel. That is something that is a firm foundation for all of us, as Martin Franzmann reminds us. It also reminds us that doctrine is intended to be practical. It's not just something where you sit in your office thinking deep thoughts, but you are concerned about reaching out with the gospel that you are agreed upon. So the theme is the righteousness of God. Key topics, especially in the first section, which is one of the more difficult sections, God's sovereign mercy. That is, he acted towards Israel with mercy, mercy, mercy. He did not allow a single one of his words to fall to the ground. They are all true. He showed himself to be a righteous God who keeps his promises, who is faithful to his promises. He is righteous towards all Israel, which would include not only believing Jews, but also believing Gentiles. He sort of redefines what Israel is. He talks about the means of grace, especially in Romans chapter 10. He also talks about the ministry of the means of grace in Romans chapter 10. If there's ever a place where there's a sedes for the doctrine of the means of grace and the ministry, it would be Romans 10. Then you have an emphasis in the latter chapters on Christian love and life as it looks when it's actually active in life, that our whole lives are considered to be holy offerings. The doctrine of vocation, in other words, comes in here. A love that seeks to fulfill the law is the essence of the commandments. The obedience to authority is true love in action. And then Christian freedom as we consider the weak in not just some autonomous freedom where we can do what we want, but freedom to be used with an eye towards and a concern for the weak. The church's mission comes up in Romans 15, and the warning against false teachers with the many warm greetings in chapter 16. So, in preparation for our first translation, Romans chapter 9, 1-5, probably the key overview to keep in mind would be this slide, that what Paul is emphasizing is God's righteous dealings with his people Israel. There's a natural question that's bound to come up as you consider the fact that although this gospel is for all, although many Gentiles have welcomed the gospel and are coming in to hear the gospel, so few of his own people have actually heard and believed the gospel. They've heard it, but they've rejected it for the most part. And so the question arises, is there something wrong with God's faithfulness? Or is there something wrong with the word? Is there something lacking in his power? Has God really kept his word to his people? And Paul makes it very clear that God is righteous in all his dealings. In fact, more than righteous, probably the key word in 9, 10, and 11 is the word mercy. And mercy, God chose some Jews and some Gentiles to be his people. God has always been choosing among the chosen. Not all Jews, just because they belong to the 12 tribes, are automatically saved. Not all Gentiles, just because they're Gentiles, are automatically damned. God has always been choosing among the chosen, and choosing in some places where you wouldn't expect him to choose people who really had no right, were not part of the people of God. In mercy, God provided salvation freely for Jew and Gentile by faith, chapter 10, through the ministry of the word. But the Jews rejected the message and its free gift. So here you see keyword mercy, salvation for Jew and Gentile. Faith comes into it. The ministry of the word comes into it. So God has done everything possible. It's not that there is any lack of will or activity on God's part that caused God's people to lose out on the gospel. It's their own rejection of this free gift. And finally, in a paradoxical way, after they reject it and then Gentiles come into the church, it is hoped and prayed for by Paul that in the mystery of God's working, people, his own kinsmen will see the fact that Gentiles are coming in and become jealous and long for the blessings that the Gentiles have as part of the native olive tree, as transplants. And so they may want to be replanted into that olive tree as well. So in mercy, God used the fact that Gentiles accepted this free gift to lead some envious Jews to accept it also. Well, I hope this is helpful to you and has given you some things to start with as you begin your translation.